Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, and those joining us online, and advocates for climate resilience. Good afternoon, and welcome to Strengthening Climate and Disaster Resilience through Youth Volunteerism here at the 2025 New York Climate Week. I'm truly honored to be with you today as we address a critical area that demands our collective attention and action. The stark reality is that climate disasters are growing in frequency and intensity, and resilience cannot be left to institutions alone. It's a collective responsibility. Young people, who comprise more than half of the global population and are uniquely positioned to respond to disasters with creativity, energy, and ethical leadership, but yet their potential is often constrained by structural barriers and limited resources. As the UN looks ahead to 2026, the International Year of Volunteers, it's clear that youth volunteerism is more than hands-on service. By using tools like social media and AI responsibly, and by sharing stories that inspire and teach, young people are shaping how communities prepare for and recover from disasters. Our esteemed panelists today, representing organizations such as the Buddhist City Foundation, Columbia Climate School, the Institute of Politics at Harvard College, and the New York Disaster and Interfaith Services, are here to share their insights on how youth volunteerism can be a driver of real climate resilience. Through their expertise, we seek to recognize and understand the successes and challenges in creating enabling environments for children and youth to contribute their part with a strong emphasis on community-based actions moving forward. I'm Nina Wu, and I'm a youth representative from the Buddhist Tzuchi Foundation. I'm also a first-year student at Harvard College, hoping to study government and economics, and I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. I will now pass that mic to Sylvie and the rest of our speakers to quickly introduce yourselves and say hello.
Hello, my name is Sylvia, and I'm a. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. My name is Sylvia, and I'm a junior at Harvard College, and I study social studies and environmental science and public policy with a secondary in earth and planetary sciences. So kind of a lot of social theory and environmental science and environmental policy. And I am the founder and chair of the program on environmental politics at the Harvard Institute of Politics.
Hi, I'm Tiffany, and I'm from Buddhist City Foundation. I work mainly with youth, mobilizing youth around the world, and doing a lot of disaster relief and humanitarian assistance.
Hi, I'm Jeff Slugamelch. It's spelled just how it sounds. I'm with the Columbia Climate School, where I am the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness and also an associate professor of professional practice.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lucy Cummings, and I am the Director of Faith Sector Resilience at New York Disaster and Interfaith Services. We are a disaster human services organization that serves New York City, looking at preparedness and resilience, response, and recovery.
Thank you all for such lovely introductions. We're now going to take this conversation in three parts. First, we're going to set the scene, followed by a discussion on barriers that youth are facing, and then closing off the conversation with solutions that we can take beyond this moment. So for our first question, I want to ask our panelists, how have you seen young people, especially vulnerable youth, lead change through volunteerism or mutual aid, and what lessons can be drawn from their approaches? So starting with Sylvie.
Yeah, I think it's a really big question in today's world. And I think that we have a lot of challenges that we all see, especially as youth. And I think something that's unique about our time right now is that youth really want to get involved. I think we're thinking about this as a collective problem in a way that we haven't really before. And so I think what you're really starting to see is climate change is an everyone problem and really mobilizing all of the youth. And that we see this as our responsibility to make a difference in the world and to try to help how we can. I think that's really unique for our time. And I think we can only increase that going forward and kind of have an obligation to our future selves to do so.
Thank you, Sylvie, for your thoughtful response on the importance of collective responsibility. Now let's hear from Tiffany and her experiences in the various local programs that Tzuchi's operating.
Yeah, so Tzuchi, in Tzuchi, we do a lot of youth activities and events, and I think one of the biggest things is really harnessing the power of youth, right? Like, for example, in Mozambique, our youth are more technology savvy. So when we're running our like our plantations and our farms, they are the people that are actually organizing. They're the people that are talking about, the yield production, and they're the people that can, like make things very creative for the local communities to be able to follow and like kind of be able to help them be more resilient in terms of food security. In the Philippines, we see that youth are taking it in another direction. So in Philippines, we know that disaster risk reduction is a big topic, facing more than 20, 30 cyclones every single year, right? So the youth on the ground there have been working with the local government to find the best ways and to come up with very creative methods on how to keep communities safe and how to respond after disasters, right? So one of the things they do is they do a door-to-door program. The youth will actually knock on doors and like talk to each family about what are the plans they have for disaster risk reduction. And then, of course, globally, we have our International Youth Leadership Program, which is a way that we're utilizing the skills of youth all around the world to learn more about the SDGs, and through that to co-create and collaborate. It's not just about all these ideas out there, but putting these ideations into implementation. So one of the parts of this program is it's called practice and action. So what they do is they have a project that they want to run, and they collaborate with our local communities to make this program like a pilot program. So in Malaysia, we are actually running a program which started off as a community garden. So it's a very small program, but then through that, now we're saying, oh, for the community garden, we want to expand and install solar panels and go from there. So it's a step-by-step process where the youth are taking charge and really implementing solutions on the ground.
Thank you, Tiffany, for your inspiring examples of how youth are taking action on the ground. Let's explore the tech perspective even more with Jeff.
Yeah, I think that there are really a lot of great ways. I'm just being reminded, I did my undergrad in theater studies in Chicago, and we had this big theater, and we would do these children's shows. And I remember our stage management professor would say that kids that you can't get away with anything with youth. And that if you had someone come out of the trap on the stage, like a peer, every kid in the front row on the mezzanine would be looking up, trying to look down into it. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of that, right? Because this is one of those examples where kids sort of see through the politics, right? It's not a political issue. All these sort of made up human things like, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just implement this solution? And with that energy and with that optimism, kind of pull together these solutions, whether it's serving as like an information exchange on social media, and oftentimes they become that conduit of communications for their family, whether it's guilting us into recycling and wearing our seatbelts, which has proven very effective as a policy tool, or otherwise just kind of being empowered to be leaders, sometimes without a choice, because that's the nature of the family dynamic. If they speak here in the US, they may speak English better than their parents and sort of serve as that conduit, but can be very important facilitators. The other piece that I would mention is that also one of the things we found through our work is that if we focus on children, we end up focusing on the whole community. We say that children are the bellwethers of disaster recovery because they're dependent on the functioning of every other aspect of civil society. We don't have to talk Republicans, Democrats, climate change, no climate change. We just have to say we're going to focus on the needs of children in disaster, and then we back out. And the next thing we know, we're taking those climate adaptation steps. We're working on the infrastructure that serves them, which is essentially the whole community.
Thank you for reflecting on how youth are creative and exploring new ways of interacting with the world. Now let's move on to Lucy to sort of share specific examples of how youth are evolving or are engaging with specific disasters.
Yeah, when Nina was talking to me and I was going through my brain, I just kept thinking about all these incredible young people who have interned or volunteered for our organization. And one specific example was around COVID and PPE distribution. But then I was thinking on the climate front, their youth have had a really important leadership role in terms of training faith leaders around climate anxiety and climate grief. There are about 5,000 houses of worship in New York City. The majority of them are serving environmental justice communities. The demographics of religious communities is that leaders tend to be older. And this whole idea of grief around the environment and anxiety that's impacting the lives of young people and all of us. It's really been young people who have helped religious leaders in their community with pastoral care and providing emotional and spiritual support. So that really stands out for me in terms of a leadership role.
Thank you so much. You can keep the mic actually. We'll go back this way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you guys for sharing about how youth are involving. Why do I keep saying involving? Engaging with the world and taking action in the local communities. And so for our second question, I want to know, what do you see as the most pressing barriers that prevent youth from building resilience in the face of climate change and disasters? Starting with you, Lucy.
In my experience, it's just this tremendous pressure that young people are under, whether or not it's unique, it's real. So for me, it's where is the funding coming from? What kind of job opportunities are we presenting in our programming where we're involving young people? Just asking young people to be involved, just to do the right thing without really taking into account the barriers that they're facing in their lives, especially when you're dealing with under-resourced communities where you have to pay the bills. So it's not enough to just say, let's all get together and do the right thing. You really have to set up a structure, mentorship, funding, professional support. So we need to do a lot better job at that.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I completely agree. I think young people definitely need more monetary support and professional support to get things moving. And so, Jeff, I would love to hear about your opinions on barriers for youth and the, I guess, systemic barriers that you see.
So I have a confession. As we were talking about this question before, in the back of my head is an episode of The West Wing that where it was a school group that came. Some of you are nodding. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. It was a good episode. And they were sort of pushing for a platform to lower the voting age. And one of the arguments that they gave in the show, spoiler alert, I don't own the rights or anything to this either. So I hope Aaron Sorkin isn't watching. The was that there are decisions that are being made today that are going to carry out over their lifetime that they don't have a say in. And so the power structures sort of favor experience and time in and sort of technical expertise, when here you have the majority of the world's population that has the biggest stake in these long-term outcomes, not necessarily having a voice in that. And in some cases within community or familial power structures may not even be encouraged to sort of practice that voice, and some they will and some they won't. And so I think finding ways to really channel that energy and really helping to elevate that perspective, as you mentioned, and elevate it into the way that we're thinking. So we're not just thinking of the short term and we'll kick that can down the road, but actually engage those who have to pick up that can that we kick down the road. I think that metaphor broke somewhere there, but you know what I mean.
Thanks, Jeff, for reflecting on how youth don't have a purpose or a voice in these decision-making structures. And now I would like to hear from Tiff on the community side of things.
Yeah, I think definitely from the structural side of things, it's an issue of a very big challenge. And then moving down, there's also more challenges in terms of community and personal level. I think for a more community kind of level, there's that intergenerational gap, right? Like, what are the things that are in place already, all these kind of set guidelines that are in place within the community that youth are struggling to break through and break apart. And that really comes down to kind of the communication they have with the older generation. I mean, there was a study that was saying something, it used to be maybe 10 years every generation, you get that gap. But now it's every 3, every 5, as more and more information comes through. And this information is something that is a barrier. Like, is this information correct? There's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, an overwhelming load of information that's coming through to youth. And I think that is a very big barrier for youth to feel engaged and not be overtaken by that anxiety of what's happening around them.
Thanks for highlighting the struggles of intergenerational gaps. And I would like to hear from Sylvie on your experiences as a young person yourself.
Absolutely. I first want to disagree with everything you're saying, Tiff, because I feel like there's just so much information that we constantly get that really stresses the gravity of climate change. Like, we know that this is a global problem, but I feel like it's really stressed often that it's a really global problem and that it kind of includes everything, that it includes, law and migration and all of these different fields. And so it feels so insurmountable sometimes. I think we think of this as this enormous problem, and it's really inconceivable to think how every individual can fit in. And I think sometimes we think of the individual platforms like recycling or wearing a seatbelt or those other, very specific programs that we talk about. But I think for young people, it's really hard to know how we can fit in. And there's this misconception that I think you have to be like an environmentalist to work on climate change. And so what I've seen and what I think the future is of climate change and of real youth mobilization towards climate is for everyone to feel like climate change is their goal, is their battle to fight, even if they're in law, even if they're going to become a doctor. And I think especially at Harvard, we see a lot of people who are kind of pre-professional, looking for what to do with their career, looking for how to make the type of difference in the world that they want to see. And I think most people feel like climate change can't be their battle because it's so big that how could they possibly fight it individually? How could they possibly take on this global by definition problem? But I really do think that integrating climate change as an everyone problem, integrating it as something that can be fought by being a doctor, by being, a really effective lawyer who just, takes on one environmental case at one point, by being a really effective architect, by being any number of careers and focusing on any number of things, but with the mindset of climate change and with the idea of problem solving and of keeping this issue in mind. I think that's the only way that we can actually go forward. And I think that that's what we have to do to, fight past this problem of it being such a global issue and such like a kind of enormous and nebulous problem to fight.
Thank you so much. So having recognized that we're facing all these issues from intergenerational gaps and power structures, I want to hear now what emerging solutions have each of you seen that hold the most promise for empowering youth to strengthen climate and disaster resilience. So starting with you, Sylvia, again.
Absolutely. I think this kind of ties to what I just spoke about briefly, just with kind of everyone getting mobilized with their respective fields. And I think we really see this at the IOP at Harvard. I think we see a lot of students who really want this to become their issue. And they really feel like they have a sense of responsibility to the world to fight for these issues that we believe in. And I think that can be in climate change, and it can be in a number of other issues as well. But just engaging students with professionals in the field by creating these intergenerational lines and strings that really pass on this generational knowledge. I think that's the only way that we can move forward. And I think by doing so, we can, keep this knowledge building, and hopefully we can, become a little bit smarter in the future to change all of these systems that are in place right now and to try to alter the norms so that they can fight for a healthier climate.
Thank you. Tiff, can you speak on the local programs and what you've seen in the volunteers across the world with Saji?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the biggest ones that we talk about is in Singapore. We have a humanistic youth center, and this center is actually co-created by Buddhist Foundation, but also by the Singaporean government. And it came from just the government is thinking about, how do we help the youth? How do we set up a center that is led by the youth, ran by the youth, for the youth? So in the center, one of the things that we try to do is have the safe space, safe, positive space. A lot of spaces might be safe, but not exactly positive. So we want to have the safe, positive space where youth are able to come together to collaborate and co-create and set up pilot programs. These pilot programs can be for the social development side of things or for the climate side of things. And with these programs, what we do is we try to provide a lot of guidance, mentoring, we provide resourcing, we provide networking opportunities so that everybody can come together, not just, youth coming together, but also how do we bring the businesses on board? How do we bring the community on board? And that is kind of like, it also helps a lot with the mental health aspects. One of the biggest things is there's a lot of anxiety about things that youth can't control, that we can't control. Just like Sylvia was talking about, this overwhelming, like, this is such a big problem. Where can we start? Like, can we do anything? And, HYC is a space where, yes, we can do something. It might be a small little thing, but, this is all a step towards the right direction. Another part that I guess Tzu Chi Foundation is very unique in is we have volunteers that range from 102 years old to 2 years old. We say that age is not a problem. It's your mentality, right? So all our volunteers work together after disasters. We see like 4-year-olds with their little buckets, pulling water. We get the 102-year-old, which their job is just to sit at the door and welcome people, but this is that intergenerational communication and working together that kind of breaks down these barriers that we see. And through this work, we can see that when we're talking about before, like when we talk about children, everybody comes together. There is no, oh, you advocate for this, I advocate for that. Children brings the community together. And that's what we want to do, is generations of people coming together for well-being and safety and children. Yeah.
Thank you, Tiff. And I think it's really inspiring to see how the Humanistic Youth Center in Singapore is taking what everyone's talking about here at the UN about holding space for youth, and yours are actually putting it into action, into an actual program. So now passing it on to Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the I'm gonna throw down a little disaster theory, but I promise I'll connect it. There's a disaster researcher, Russell Dines, in the 1960s, 1970s, sort of observed the behavior of organizations. Several of them did, but he wrote about what I'm about to talk about, which is these different emergent players within the community. And these type 1 actors would be ones that your emergency management, your first responders, they're built for it. Your type 2 are ones that extend what they do, like a hospital has an emergency department. Suddenly it's doing a lot more of that. Your type 3 are groups like maybe your faith-based organizations that are suddenly and unexpectedly involved in sheltering. They're taking on completely new missions. And these type 4s are ones that have completely emerged. I mean, we've seen this here in the New York area with the Occupy Sandy movement, right? We see it in every disaster where there are unmet needs and there are people within the community emerging to meet that. And we're increasingly seeing youth coming together and emerging both in the acute disaster space, but as well as longer term within climate advocacy. The example of Greta Thunberg and the emergence there through online communities and online connectivity. So the internet and the connections across the internet are something that are often in the news for the bad side of things, which are true and have to be taken very seriously in terms of all of the harm that could be done. But it's also created connection points across all different communities, including youth, so that they can have a larger community, a larger social network around these areas, and can be a very, very powerful force for good and force for advocacy and force for innovation, and also letting people know that they're not alone in terms of this, and that there are sort of these positive, safe spaces that exist in the virtual space as well as the physical.
Thank you. And it's great to hear about the specifics about disasters and how they're categorized. And now, Lucy, would you like to share some specific examples that you've seen through your organization?
Yeah, I love building upon this kind of solutions through collaborations and breaking down the silos. We have a new, very exciting program. So I apologize. I'm going to just wave the flag for this program. It's called Climate Ready Audits for Houses of Worship. And our partner is a green workforce development program called Green City Force. And it's a program for targeting young people who are living in public housing communities in New York City. And they are our partners in delivering the audit. It's funded by Con Edison. And they're doing it because they see the need in their community, but they also they're getting trained in green building trades. They're looking at kind of more innovation around resilience, or the idea of resilience as a risk that we need to build, that we need to be addressing. And for the faith communities themselves, it's really important to have young people from the community taking the lead on this program. So, and then there are also a lot of leadership opportunities for the core members. So it's this virtuous circle, right? It's trying to, it's more than climate, kind of, Sylvia, and what everyone's been talking about is how do we bring it all together? How do we break down the cycles? How do we put together those virtuous circles?
Thank you so much, everyone, for such insightful words and for showing us how to build off of the experiences that you've each been through. Recognizing that the battle is long and there is still a lot that needs to be done, it really is integral that we look at climate preparedness through a wider range of perspectives. And we saw that through the topics of disaster response, technology, and community engagement. They're all truly interconnected with each other and must be addressed holistically. That being said, I'd like to now open it up for some questions from the audience for our speakers. If anyone has any questions, raise your hand.
Thank you, and thank you all for this bouquet of insights into youth mobilization. I've been close to some youth that have recently overthrown governments in Bangladesh, Nepal, and almost Kenya. And I'm just wondering how you've seen, what kind of lessons can youth mobilization learn from those countries? Because that's way beyond our traditional ideas of volunteerism.
I'm happy to take that just to start. I was actually in Kenya during the youth uprisings. I know, which is super cool. I was studying environmental science with like a Harvard program, but half the students were from Kenya and half the students were Harvard students. And so for me, it was incredibly inspiring to see all of these students actually stand up and fight for what they believed in. And the students that were alongside us, learning that environmental science, learning about, climate change, then really focus their efforts on, fighting for a better world through government and through politics. And every single one of them was ready to lay down their life to fight for, social change that they really believed in order to fight for education for everyone, for access to healthcare for everyone. For I feel like these values that we sometimes take for granted or we don't really think about as like unalienable rights or as values that you have to defend. And so I think seeing this as an issue that's greater than yourself, seeing these students who are really ready to just risk it all and to lose their families and to lose everything just to fight for this safer world, I think was the most inspiring part of being in Kenya at this time. And I think that can really be applied towards climate change as well. Like, I think we're starting to see it as an issue where you really need to think of it as like a existential crisis and like as an existential risk for youth and for our generation in general. And so I think treating these values not as a given, but as something we need to fight for and is something that all of us collectively really need to take seriously and be willing to risk something for, I think is kind of the solution to all of these problems that we've been discussing. And also, what you can learn from Bangladesh and Nepal and Kenya.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, it's worth noting where we a lot of times where you see broad scale societal change, these are, youth-led movements or younger generations kind of saying like, yeah, this isn't going to work for us, right? And pushing that forward. I want to be a little careful because while we're hearing about the successes, we're not hearing about the failures. We're not hearing about the attempts, and it is a very, and I know everyone here knows this all too well, it is an increasingly dangerous time to be going against governments at a time where a lot of kind of the rules of engagement and conflict are eroding. And even in peacetime, we're seeing actions being taken in this country, right, that are we never thought we'd see in our lifetime. or in anyone's lifetime in this country. And so I say all this just to say that it's important to recognize what works, but it's also important to recognize this can play out very differently in different situations, and that extreme measures in the right context do the job that they need to do. But that doesn't, but it's not always the first tool to go to, right? You know what I mean? So I don't want to sound like I'm discouraging it, but I also just want to say that there are very, very real consequences, and there are a lot of lives that are lost in very bad ways. And it's important that that's part of the conversation. And so I'm glad you asked this question and glad you brought it up, because this is where we're at. This is the level of intensity that we're at, and we need to understand this from all sides.
And if there's any questions from any of the people joining from online, feel free to type in the chat and we'll get to them as well. If anyone here has any questions, feel free to raise your hand.
I'm so grateful for this panel and the insights that are being shared. I think sometimes we think of like youth engagement and like environmental work as separate spaces because of like technicalities or expertise, right? And to hear this narrative come through of like how climate change is an everyone problem and how we're working through different levers to kind of activate that, I think is really beautiful. I kind of want to build on the conversation around barriers. I think there's something said about like how funding barriers, decision-making structure barriers, misinformation, kind of this like, how do we all fit into the picture? I think I'd be so curious, like, where are you seeing the solutions to those barriers, right? Like, are we seeing examples come forth where like governments are incentivized to fund youth participation and that it's yielding to better results within climate policy making? I'd also be curious to hear like maybe from the houses of worship side, right? Like, how are we combating that misinformation and like the dissemination of truth in this moment where like truth is such an abstract concept, right? And then also thinking about like this like mutual aid network and like how we like really inspire youth to become more in alignment with that vision of like climate change is my problem. How do we juggle that with also the overwhelm of trying to simply exist, find jobs, and like have an income and survive in this very like complex world that I think our Gen Z is like growing into right now in this moment? Would love some reflections on that.
Thank you for that very narrow question. I think we focus on disaster human services and climate adaptation and climate resilience, and and we're just constantly fighting for job opportunities in these fields for young people, or training opportunities for young people, and I think in especially in disaster human services where it's a very hierarchical structure. It's kind of a top-down command control because, of course, when you're talking in a disaster crisis situation, it's about kind of an orderly response. And that doesn't just it just doesn't leave a lot of room for decentralized power and bottom up activation and when people don't have the accredited skill sets. So it's part of I think what we tend to fight for is just this bigger picture. How do we shift this bigger picture? And, again, for us as a not-for-profit, it's about changing, getting more funding in the structure, advocating for government incentives around youth involvement. It's very kind of practical advocacy work around that area. But yeah, those are just some of my thoughts.
I would add in too, it's been interesting really I grew up in the 90s in the Silicon Valley, and that was an era where the kind of youth generations had an unprecedented level of disposable income. And so a lot of the major brands, right, Adidas, Reebok, we're specifically targeting and engaging marketing to really some kind of scary levels in terms of understanding behavior and trying to have influencers using their products. But what it showed was that there was tremendous influence. Now we fast forward to where we are now. And of course, obviously, this is at the older end of youth, but we're seeing a lot of investment vehicles with social impact as a part of it, or demanding we have investment packages that have no investments in fossil fuel companies, things like that. And a lot of this is being driven by youth, not exclusively, right? But it's because of the purchasing power and the behavior and kind of the cultural influence. And this sort of cascades across all sorts of different policies. And so I think as these groups unite, it's sort of emerging into and creating the future market trends. So there are sort of some market incentives that have really helped to sort of move some of the major commercial forces. I shouldn't say maybe move is a strong word, but start to nudge them in directions to offer more socially conscious products, more environmentally friendly products. So I'd also say too that not only the current earnings but future earnings create some really important economic signals that could that we've seen some initial influence in.
Yeah, so I think in terms of like creating social impacts, there's also like creating community. I think that's from a very community level. If you create a community that is heading towards the same direction, like there's power in that, and having those conversations within the community. I think that's something that we're doing here, right? Like creating a community. We all come from different walks of life, different socioeconomic standards. Like we are all creating this community that is doing something. And for youth, especially, I think it's harnessing social media. I think that's another one where, yesterday, I think we had a global ethical stock take. And one of the youth was saying, oh, well, I'm going to respect people that are going to respect me. And I'm going to be engaging with like the social media side of things a lot more, right? Like if you come up to me on the streets, I might not want to talk to you. But if you're talking to me online, maybe that's something that I can have thoughts where I can think about before I can reply to your answer. And I think that's the thing, is understanding what youths are. There are different types of youth, but it's this understanding that it is different now and things are different, and this creating this community that is suited towards the needs of youth.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything that all three of you have said. I also think that just the power of conversations, just as you've been saying, cannot be understated. Because I think especially with what the question was kind of touching to about the challenges of employment right now, and especially what college students are thinking, I know that a lot of my peers and I are like, oh my God, there are just like no jobs. And it's really hard to see what a future looks like in any career, much less fighting for climate, much less fighting for a lot of these social values that we care about. But it feels like there's a diminishing market for it. Every day it feels like there's less. And I feel like just having conversations, posting on social media, even if you're like on top of a mountain, you're like, wow, it's really beautiful. Like we need to fight to protect this. We need to keep this top of mind. I think if we can keep that part of the central conversation when young people are deciding what to go into and deciding what to focus their lives on, I think that's all we can do right now. And I think that there is a lot of focus just in society in general with this top-down approach. But I think among the youth, we really think about this bottom-up approach of how can every single one of us do what we can in our everyday lives. And I think if that includes just, thinking of how beautiful the sunset is when you're factoring in what job you're going to go into or what you want to do with your life. And maybe you can like fight to protect the climate a little bit more through that. I think that can be really powerful, especially if everyone ends up doing that.
Beautiful. Thank you guys for those reflections. I have two questions online. One's very cute, and I think one's a little more elaborate. So one's asking, what is giving you hope in this moment of like how we're sitting? And then the second question is like, how do we ensure that like as organizations that don't work with you, work with youth, there seems to be a like use case of like the power and importance of youth volunteerism. What is your call to action for organizations that aren't thinking about engaging with youth? Why is it so meaningful to try to have them be involved in your work in building climate and disaster resilience?
So I could start to tackle just the first one. What gives me hope? I mean, I want to tackle that because I feel like that's a fun question. I feel like there's so much reason to have hope. And I think maybe I'm an optimistic person by nature, but I really think that just seeing so many people that are really engaged with climate right now and that really think of these problems as their problem to tackle. And even just, having three other wonderful panelists who are focusing on this and are really engaging these issues just in everyday life. And I think having New York Climate Week where we can focus on these conversations, I think that gives me hope. And I think seeing all of my peers and all of the people just, in the world who are young and who are fighting for this and who are going to go into the workforce with this mindset, that gives me so much hope. And I'm positive that we're going to be able to make a positive impact in the future with that.
I think I want to answer that question too. I mean, definitely, in these few years, I've been to a lot of different countries, and like the youth in Mozambique gives me hope. A few of them, actually, many of them have never left their village at all. But when we talk to them about sustainability, when we talk to them about, like climate change, the next day they are sharing with their community and they're leading this charge on how do we make our villages more climate resilient? How are we how are we taking care of the elders in our villages? And that gives me hope because it's knowledge is so sparse for them, but when they have the knowledge, they want to go forward and do it. It's not about that. Like conversation is good, but then it's then how do we lead from conversation into action? In the Philippines, working with youth who was the only youth in their village, and she was saying that, oh, I'm going to start a garden. That gives me hope. It's just one little thing, but you see youth all around the world that is doing something for their community and doing something for the climate and our earth, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think it's a similar sentiment. So this is this is Climate Week. There are over 900 registered events that are going on. This is my eighth, and really all of them, 6 out of the 8 have been really full of, no, but they've been really like serious conversations. And even where, I'm on a panel of people that disagree, or we're arguing over financial vehicles that should be used and who has responsibility for what, it's a conversation that's designed to produce outcomes. It's what we should be doing, right? It shouldn't be one-sided. It shouldn't be polarized. It should be something where we're debating these things and working through it. And so I'm seeing more and more substance, and at all of these events, seeing more and more students, seeing more youth groups. And I think, with the second question in terms of engagement and engaging with youth, I first saw this in the STEM fields, the scientific and mathematical fields, where there's always a shortage of the pipeline. And so they're trying to sort of inspire action among the youth. And it makes me thinking that's so important to sort of expose that this isn't just a class you have to take in school or something you're reading about in the paper. It is an exciting, a messy, a challenging environment where you have to work with different people, different topics, different information streams, and navigate that. And that's our pipeline of current and future leaders, and the opportunity to build competency and exposure that we didn't have, that we've had to figure out along the way. And I think that's also one of the most important imperatives, not only to kind of engage the youth to make sure that perspective is at the table, which is the most important reason, but also to develop those skills of working across different fields, working across different communities in a productive way that we're sort of fumbling our ways through.
I'll take a shot at the second question about why, what's our pitch for working with youth organizations. And for us, this is win-win. Like, are you faith leaders, are you crazy? There are these amazing youth-led environmental justice organizations. This is partnerships help build capacity. And in one specific case, we were having a lunch that's around New York City with faith leaders, really trying to understand, sharing a meal at different places around New York City at different houses of worship. And in the Bronx, the leadership was talking about extreme heat and poor air quality and rates of asthma and struggling as community leaders. And they didn't know about the work of We Act for Environmental Justice and Bronx Unite, and these incredible forward thinking, change making organizations. So you build bridges, and they were a bit gobsmacked, like, wow, this, we have these leaders already. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. So a lot of it is this bridge building that we've been talking about, and that it's kind of win-win.
I have another question online about inclusion of different groups of youth. So opportunities are more open, exposed to youth in developed countries. So how can we ensure Indigenous youth or like marginalized groups are meaningfully included in resilience and volunteer efforts? And then what strategies have you worked to engage these groups effectively? And then how can we open like opportunities and resources to all the youth groups equally?
I mean, I've talked about this already, but I think from a climate perspective, given how tight funding is and given how kind of depressing sometimes the economic and government environment can seem, looking at workforce development as a pathway around climate action, we're trying to explore, approaching it from different angles so that it's so that we can address one of the major issues that we're hearing again and again is jobs. So what if we just went down that pathway to talk about climate rather than kind of a more macro perspective? We're not successful yet, but we're trying.
No, I think this is, I always think of this analogy. If you look at a mountain when it's not raining, when it does rain where the rain falls, right? It goes through the gullies and little canyons that it cuts coming down. Historically disadvantaged, historically underrepresented communities are harder to reach. They're not in the gullies where the water flows. And so they don't get the resources after a disaster. They don't have what we call the vertical social capital, which is just a fancy way of saying they're not as well connected with the political establishment where the resources flow. They're further up the hill. They're harder to reach. So when we talk about our engagement strategies, we have to spend more time, more effort, and yes, more money to get the same mileage and to reach folks where they are. It might mean bringing in translators. It might mean engaging with communities that are suspicious of us coming in and genuinely sort of building that relationship with them. But it's an investment, and it's an investment that is the only way to sort of undo this vicious cycle of sort of focusing on what's easiest, on what's the quickest way to get things done, to get through most people. And then we end up leaving out the same groups again and again. And so we've done a lot of our work in the US. Actually, a good portion of my center right now is at the tribal training week held by our National Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. That is an effort to kind of bring together different tribal communities. And our successes come from partnering with the National Tribal Emergency Management Council. We have this program, we have our expertise. We don't have the cultural expertise. We don't have the community expertise in these different communities. And so we made sure that, before even thinking about doing this kind of work, we would be partnering with those from the community who represent that set of expertise to be true partners in all of this. And so I'd say, all of these things, to be totally frank, it costs more upfront. It takes longer upfront, but it's an investment. It's not really a cost. It's something that generates just so much more activity, more input, more benefit in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we can really use towards helping these marginalized communities in a way that's not always easy to see at first is that all of these issues are so related to each other, so deeply connected. And I think that if we can look at, which households don't have access to healthcare, chances are they might also not have air conditioning. And so with rising temperatures, they might be the most at risk. And so I think we can look at a lot of the information and a lot of the data that we already have on where marginalized communities are, what access or what lack of access they might have to social resources, and then really applying that towards climate change. And I think that that's kind of how we can include a lot of the different links that climate change really pulls on and a lot of the weaknesses that it exposes in societies. And I think it is just so important because then if we target, access to healthcare, access to climate change mitigation techniques in their local communities, it's also likely to, really address a lot of the other underlying issues. Maybe they're more racially motivated issues or whatever it is. And I think it can only be benefited by targeting climate change.
Beautiful. Thank you guys so much for answering those questions from online. Want to quickly check if there's any questions from the room? If not, oh, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Do you think that universities right now are doing a good job in terms of igniting this youth volunteerism, in terms of all the skills that are needed, like a living laboratory? Or they are more like ivory towers, a little bit struggling to develop these skills in the youth, K-12 or universities in undergraduate programs?
Okay. Yes. So I mean, the part of my portfolio at the climate school includes our pre-college programs, and it's small, but it's something that we're always trying to do. Some of it is we work with partners like a group that in Vermont that does a summer camp, and we bring a lot of people down to sort of teach and engage with that and bring it alive. For some of our research centers, we'll have like open house days to bring folks in. We're actually working to program even more work in the communities where we actually reside, because this is always a challenge with large universities, is we talk about community impact, but we don't always necessarily honor that relationship with our host community to the extent that we would like to, or we aspire to. And so that's something we certainly are do some soul searching on as well too, and are looking at ways, and the programs that I'm overseeing are actively developing ways to better do that. But I think that there's so much more work to be done. I mean, the university business model is based on sort of the older end of the youth definition, how we want to define it, and also kind of research, graduate programs, postgraduate programs, things like that as well too. And it's very quickly in sort of the frenzy of all of that to make the space, to make the time, to make that connection. It's something we have to constantly remind ourselves of. So it's also something too where, I'll even sort of state my own, like I'm sitting here saying all these wonderful things, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I need to do more to actually sort of live up to this and make space for this and identify it within a day that only has 24 hours in it. And so I think we need to challenge ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. So to summarize, my answer to both of your questions is yes.
I might add the Harvard perspective. I'm going to add some nuance and also just say yes. But I really do think that just by introducing students to what these issues can look like and making this feel like it's our problem too, that does so much. Like I came into college thinking that I was going to study just earth sciences. I'd like never really heard of government or policy or anything like that. Or maybe I'd heard of it, but just kind of tangentially. And I got to college and I saw all of this research that was being done that was looking at these real issues. I took a class on PFAS, which are those like microplastics that are in a lot of water and a lot of different environments around the United States and the world right now. And it was a deep dive into one case study on PFAS in a farm and looking at the community that was actually impacted by it. And so it was kind of an earth science class. And so we were looking at, samples and doing analysis in labs and everything like that. But then we were looking at the policy implications of that. And I think that was the first moment when I was like, wow, like policy actually really does something. You can have the science, you can have this abstract research, but then I think universities show you that you can actually take this forward and that you need to apply this to the world. And at least for me, my mind was blown. I was like, wow, I really feel like this is my issue. This is something that I can focus on. And I also think a really big part of universities these days is the extracurricular opportunities that you have. So I think the IOP at Harvard is a really good example of really showing students how to get involved, how to stay engaged, how to really visualize yourself making an impact and making a change in the world. And I think this type of change-making mentality is exactly what the world needs right now. And, I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, Harvard is a perfect place, because I think there are so many issues. And a lot of times we can have discussions that seem out of touch to the real concerns of society. But I think with that, all of the research is grounded in real problems that are going on and grounded in exposing students to these opportunities and exposing students to how we can actually make a difference, how we can make this change that we look at, and how we can really make the world a better place. And so I think to do that, we need to just support our universities, and we need to, keep funding research, because I think it just benefits all of society. And I think for universities, we need to think about how to stay grounded in this mission of actually helping society and doing research that makes the type of impact we want to make and doesn't just research for the point of research.
I was just going to say, we don't have any problems at Columbia University. And so, and your credits will transfer if you're.
I'm just going to add one thing. We, as an employer, we see so many incredible young people who are passionate about climate. And so I don't think there's any issue in terms of education and exposure. I would love more training of career counselors and alumni networks, because we just oftentimes run into young people who are so discouraged at how few jobs are out there that are climate focused. But in fact, there are many jobs that are climate focused, but they don't have climate in the job description. So it would be great if there was more training on that end to help broaden the market, so to speak.
I'm gonna add one more quick thing, which is that, yeah. I also really think that it needs to start before universities. Like I went to a public high school in New Jersey, just across the river, and I didn't really have any classes that were focused on climate change. I didn't think about this as a really topical issue for our generation. The way that I thought about like physics and math and chemistry is like important topics for our generation, or some capacity of that. I don't know really how much, but I think it needs to start before university. Like we need to see this as an issue in middle school and elementary school. If not that, then in high school. And I think that by making this part of the public education, like it kind of makes it like a universal problem the way I think it actually is. And so just kind of acknowledging that in the curriculum with college counselors or career counselors or just better classes, more targeted classes, I think that can do a lot.
I think it really segues into, we need to start young. I think that's one of the biggest things. I mean, Tsuji, we have a lot of preschools, kindergartens, and we start with talking about proteins. We talk about, plant-based diets. We talk to them about, sustainability, and they are 3 years old. So we use things that they can understand. And from there, they can actually influence their parents, their grandparents. And you see this like child who has this knowledge and is actually parents listen to their children a lot more than we think, and it changes the dynamics of the family. And one of the things, like even on the wall that we see here, it's our refugee school in Turkey, our Syrian refugee school, Al Manahai, and you see that through the education they are able to change their perspectives, and they are able to have a lot of hopes about how to create a better future. And it's starting from very small things, but children have the capacity. They're like sponges that are absorbing everything. So by the time they get to university, they already know what they want. They know that this environment is something they need to protect.
Thank you guys so much. Oh, I got 2 hands.
Really appreciate all the inspiring talk. And I feel like also in the I think it's great. First, like thanks for Columbia to have this pre-college program. We actually got some of the Columbia secondary high school students to join our internship, where we run a youth project that use climate film as a way to do climate storytellings. But this really kind of echo all you were saying. This has to start when they're young. The K through 12 education really help to build the foundation. And I agree with you, the online tool is so powerful. That's how you can influence Gen Z for now. But one of our core is to take the young people to the nature. And it's like because one thing that I think what makes the Gen Z so depressing is they're kind of doing groom scrolling a lot of times. And it just kind of, for us, we have to do a lot of healing before we can activate them for the climate activism. And so that's kind of something I feel like it's a little missing in the climate educations. I feel like everybody kind of focused so much on the STEM ed, but not looking at K through 12, like we did a project with a kindergartner class and just like use the Octopus Garden songs and have them do claymations, connect them to the animal, to the nature, and kind of, I felt like psychological foundation is where you can make this climate movement sustainable. Otherwise, I've seen so, like I got inspired by Greta, which is kind of really an open call. Like this is the first social movement that I see led by young people, and I really follow her. But to see her like going through this psychological kind of roller coaster, getting so depressed, and then kind of try to come up. It's kind of, I feel like there's something we need to address. Like when we work with young people, the youth volunteerism, there's something we need to be a little more delicate, not to kind of get them burned out before they kind of really jump right in and so I just feel like we're gonna kind of share our project with NYU STEM teacher tomorrow. Just kind of how do you use storytelling? How do you use art in kind of activate the youth activism and working with city government? I don't know if you heard of Youth Action 50. They're giving kind of high school students community service hours, their seal of civic engagement on their diploma, high school diploma, and then giving them certificate. So all these things to help them kind of have a better kind of career readiness, connect to the city government agencies. So I think there's a lot of hope there, but I just like want to put in the kind of the youth kind of work where how we need to be a little more kind of be aware of their mental health issue as well.
Yeah, I don't want to play on that too and say that one, thank you. And I definitely was on a panel this morning and we were talking about community and the mental health and anxiety and all the things you mentioned across age groups was brought up. And I will say too, we don't always do a good job in the scientific community of messaging in a way that doesn't cause anxiety, right? We take a very alarmist approach. And it's been well-intentioned, but oftentimes to our detriment. I work on the climate adaptation space and the resilience space. And for the last, in the 90s, when we first started talking about climate change, it was all about mitigation and reducing emissions. You were not allowed to talk about adaptation. You would not get invited to the meeting. You would not get an agenda item because if you did not, because that was the only thing that could fix this. And if you gave up on that, we were giving up. It's a moral hazard. We're giving up position. Now we're 30 years behind on multi-decadal infrastructure projects that we need to protect from it. So when we talk about educating youth and bringing youth into this, I think this is also something on working with more of an open mind that we need to accept. It's not if we miss 2 degrees, we're all dead, right? If we miss 2 degrees, it's going to get harder and we have to work harder, right? And so I think these are the kinds of messages there's an urgency, but I think we create an artificial sort of apocalypse that we need to sort of check ourselves a little bit. And I speak more as sort of the climate academia a little bit too. And we'll look at the formula on the board and say, these are the numbers that'll fix it. But we don't step back and look at the bigger picture and say, well, we're going to have conflict. We're going to have these other things, but maybe we can do some of this stuff. And so there's also a lot of solutions, carbon sequestration and things like that are going to be essential that we weren't allowed to talk about for 20 years. And there's no such thing as a single solution. I always say, if anyone tells you that there's one solution, they're probably a startup and they're asking for investment.
Maybe building on Lou's reflections, and then we'll pass the questions this way and this way. I know all of you work with youth within your capacities to build resilience. Can we reflect a little bit also on how you're cultivating that emotional resilience for our youth? I think that's maybe one dimension of the conversation that I'd love to like hear some like insights into, like recognizing that so much of this is also like we're called and compelled to serve because we care about the climate. How are we equipping our young people with the emotional resilience to really be able to kind of cope with the gravity of these issues?
Since I have the mic, I'll just very quickly say we try to focus on solutions rather than say, here are the things to be afraid of. It's here are steps you can take. It's sort of empowering within that context. Within the disaster space, we kind of have more options of like building, solar ovens and kind of science projects that go along with it. So we have some nice tools with that. But I'd say it's trying to empower through solutions rather than focusing on the negative.
We do the exact same at the IOP. We really try to focus on kind of hope rather than catastrophizing. I think it's all too easy to focus on everything wrong with the world. But I think really focusing on the spaces that we can make a positive impact just keeps us, smiling a little bit. Just a little.
I think it's also providing leadership opportunities. There's a program that we're working on with the same Green City Force team called Resilience-ville. And it's a kind of scenario planning exercise in a fictitious town of Resilient-ville, and everyone has a role, and it's about mutual aid. But the Green City Force Corps members are delivering this to different houses of worship across the city, and they're in the lead. And so that just feels motivating. And so we found that made a difference just in terms of positive feeling.
I definitely think it's about action as well, but like putting things into action, like one step at a time, like focusing on things that we can do, building that community to work on things together is a big one.
Let's pitch discussion, everyone.
We got that.
Yeah, we'll go ahead.
Thanks so much for this wonderful rich discussion.
Here we go.
Okay, thank you. My question is to Sylvie's wonderfully expressed point that climate is an everyone problem, and to the point of making this relevant. Outside of our professional roles and capacities, sort of as individuals, all of us, what can we do as individuals to help engage, build the movement, mobilize all the youth that are within our personal, our family, our community, local community circles, right? Or even others who have a role to play in supporting youth?
I guess I'll start. I have the mic. So I think one of the things is information, right? Like we talked about a lot of disinformation, misinformation, is giving the right information and coming together to understand what exactly is happening. I think a lot of anxiety actually comes from not understanding. So if we are able to understand, and then from there to actually take things into action on our daily lives, I think there is like very small things that we can do. Like when we talked about social media, is like talking about the sunsets of the world, talking about the forest that we walk through, talking about stories that touch our hearts, that often are very intertwined intertwined with the environment and the nature that are from our childhood and from our safe spaces. And I think that is one way that we, as people personally, we are able to engage and to spread the message.
Absolutely. I said I was going to try not to bring up social theory, but
Said I'd have your back.
yeah. I mean, I really think we need to think of society as is the sum of all of the individuals. And so what are our actions, if not just what every individual person does? And I think that to make change in climate, the little things like turning off the lights and, trying to eat vegetarian once a week actually do make a big difference if everyone does it. And I think in your own career, whatever that may be, if you could just factor in the environment just a little bit, like maybe you're choosing between two materials for some building project or something, and you choose the one that's, cents to $1 more expensive, but it makes a little bit of a difference, and you can just make these little decisions over and over and over again. that adds up. And if everyone does that, it really adds up. And so I think just engaging this and, turn off the lights and shower for a little bit less, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. I'm trying to decide which one to go with. Okay. Yeah. No, I think also listening more. So I have a colleague who actually the event I just came from was facilitating a group on climate storytelling and using storytelling. And in his dissertation work, he was interviewing emergency managers on climate change and how they were integrating it into their work. And what he found along the way was that a large number of them did not believe in climate change. I was like, oof, what do we do here? And so we just kept asking the questions, kept listening, and then later what he learned was that actually they were very open to implementing the types of actions and the resilience actions, and they were recognizing that their communities were being affected more. So if we got rid of the words climate change, if we got rid of that debate, all of a sudden it found that we weren't that far apart. And I think that this is really important. I think a lot of times this is framed as how do we win the argument? And we don't need to win the argument to actually achieve this mutual goal. It's what are the drivers of the behavior? And I say to listen because I think sometimes I was born in Northwest Indiana outside Chicago, not too far from Gary, Indiana, and the rise and fall of U.S. Steel. My dad worked at a chemical plant doing shift work until he finished college, and we moved to the Bay Area in California. So I got to see two very different worlds. And those are the world that we left was one where people lost their pensions. A lot of things were outsourced due to globalization. They were promised, that they would have job training, which never came because the economy did great because of the tech sector in the Bay Area and elsewhere. And they were kind of lost in that data. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't seem so far-fetched when we see some of the backlash, when we say, okay, these manufacturing jobs, they're very polluting. So we're going to make them harder to do. We're going to make them more expensive and less. And so then all of a sudden, we start to see that this resistance isn't coming from a political place. It's coming from an experiential place. And where can we find that common ground on sort of, and also address sort of this underlying factor? It's hard to tell someone to be more green when they're struggling to pay the bills, right? And so I think we can be more compassionate in our own life and also sort of pull back and listen to where are people coming from in this, and how can we get to the same place even if we maybe take different roads or call the road by a different name. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just echo, I think, what Lou said and Tiffany about just going into nature. I've heard that's perhaps too general, but just we talk a lot about mental health, right? Because trauma is a big part of disaster human services, and that link between nature and mental health is so real, and so folks get that. So I think that's one way that we do that. Or I'll quickly pass it over.
Any other questions from the room? If not, we'll transition to our second part of the panel experience. So first, please join me in thanking our panel for their lovely reflections. So we'll invite our panelists to come down to the breakout tables to join us. We're gonna go into a small little group sharing activity. We're back to work, baby. So I think we've had such lovely breakout conversations, and so grateful to our audience for really engaging in this storytelling and really understanding how not only actions we can take as young people, but also how we're kind of experiencing the climate crisis, disaster resilience. As we close this panel, I think I want to hold space maybe for some final closing remarks from each of you. So maybe I'll start with Sylvie.
Excellent. So I just want to start my closing remarks just by thanking everyone for coming out and thanking my fellow panelists for your words, because I really think that this is what we need for the future. And I think caring about these issues, seeing yourself in the solutions, and just being here and showing up is really what makes the difference. And so if I can just impart one final thing is keep making that difference, keep showing up, keep doing what you can, keep voting, keep staying engaged with these issues, and that's going to make the difference in the world. So thank you.
I think one of the things is hope. I think that's one thing that I really found in this community is there's a lot of hope out there. I mean, there's a lot of despair, but hope wins out in a sense. If everybody keeps on to that hope and just keep doing one step at a time, we'll head towards the right direction. And don't find like you don't have community because there's people around you all the time that can be with you on this journey.
My wife said you're not supposed to end something with someone else's quote. But I'm going to quote someone. Yeah, and I guess I'm quoting two people. Well played. We had a visit from the UN Special Advisor for Disaster Risk Reduction, Kamal Kishore, and the sentiment that he expressed in his closing remarks, which I'll share here, is optimism is our only choice. Optimism is the only path forward. It's the only one that provides the solutions that we need. And I walk out today very optimistic.
I echo all of that and just again saying thank you. I love the diversity of our panel at our table. We were with folks from Taiwan and Singapore and South Africa and England and Mexico. I mean, an incredible richness of experience, and that's special. So thank you.
Thanks. I think with that, we close with a lot of gratitude. I think this panel has really surfaced some beautiful action points, and together, I think in partnership, we continue to carry this work forward. So please join me in thanking our panel one last time for their lovely contributions.